Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Magdalena Beran will defend the academic thesis Aetiology of Dementia and Depression, Untangling the Role of Biomarkers and Sociodemographic Factors. And may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear colleagues, family, friends. Thank you very much for your attendance of the public defense of my doctoral thesis entitled Aetiology of Dementia and Depression, Untangling the Role of Biomarkers and Sociodemographic Factors. Within the next 50 minutes, I would like to tell you about my research into the etiology of two diseases that probably everyone in this room has heard about and maybe even knows someone who is affected by them. Why? Because of the devastating impact on the individuals and their surroundings, and also the high occurrence in the general population. By the age of 65, it is estimated that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have experienced at least one episode of major depressive disorder. Dementia is estimated to currently affect around 57 million individuals worldwide. This is more than 3 times the number of inhabitants of the Netherlands and more than 6 times the population of Austria. Although dementia mainly affects older individuals, it is not the normal part of aging. Dementia is a syndrome or a group of symptoms, usually by a chronic or progressive nature and caused by a variety of underlying illnesses. It is characterized by loss of memory, loss in language skills, loss in problem-solving skills, and impairment of activities of daily living. Depression is a mood disorder that is characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, tiredness and lack of energy, feelings of guilt and self-blame, trouble concentrating, a loss of interest and pleasure in doing things, and, in the worst cases, frequent suicidal thoughts and maybe even attempts. Importantly, not every depression is the same. Depression is a heterogeneous disease with multiple forms of expression, differences in the disease course, and also differences in origin. It might be caused by biological factors, but it might also be caused by environmental factors, such as social network characteristics. Therefore, in Chapter 2 of this thesis, we looked into individuals who are free from dementia at baseline and investigated the social networks. We then looked over time who of these individuals remained free from depression and who developed depression at the follow-up moment. By doing that, we could actually see that individuals with a lower percentage of family members in their social network were at a higher risk of experiencing depression at the follow-up moment. We have also observed that individuals who had a lower emotional social support at baseline were at a higher risk for depression at the follow-up moment. In chapters 3 and 4, we moved on to explore biological risk factors for depression. Depression alone is devastating, but co-occurrence with other diseases, such as diabetes, even more reduces quality of life, increases cardiac events, cardiovascular mortality, and all-cause mortality. Individuals with depression are at a 40 to 60% increased risk of having diabetes. Individuals with diabetes are at a 10 to 15% increased risk of experiencing comorbid depression. However, the biological mechanisms linking these two diseases are incompletely understood. Prior research has actually suggested HbA1c levels as a potential linking mechanism. With HbA1c levels, I refer to the average blood glucose levels over a span of 12 weeks, which are a key target in diabetes therapy and monitoring. Therefore, in Chapter 3, we meta-analyzed the currently available literature on the association of depressive symptoms and HbA1c levels over time. We did so analyzing cohort studies. And we indeed found evidence for a potential bidirectional association, with high levels of depressive symptoms being associated with elevated HbA1c levels and vice versa. In Chapter 4, we systematically reviewed the current literature on the impact of interventions targeting reductions in HbA1c levels on depressive symptoms. Our findings indicated that there might be an effect of HbA1c reduction on depressive symptoms, but the limited number of studies and also the diversity in interventions prevented us from establishing a pooled effect. In chapters 5 to 10, we shifted our focus onto dementia. As depression, dementia has multiple underlying causes and risk factors. We therefore, again, explored both biological mechanisms and sociodemographic factors that might be linked to dementia. As mentioned before, one of the hallmarks of dementia is a deterioration in cognitive functioning, and there exists a plethora of cognitive tests. A widely used test in neuropsychological assessment is the semantic fluency test, also called category fluency test, which we focused on in chapters 5 and 6. I would now like to invite everyone to take at least 1 to 2 minutes to think of as many animals as you can while I introduce the semantic fluency test. So what you can see here on this slide is a span of animals that a participant has produced. And traditionally, this test is scored by adding up the amount of animals that the participant has said. And as you can imagine, the more animals, the better the cognitive functioning. However, prior studies have actually shown that it makes a difference in what animals a participant says. I would like to illustrate this by an example. On this slide here, you can see magpie. In German, it's an Elster, of Exter in het Nederlands. I would like to compare this to cat, which I think is self-explanatory. What you can see here now is that the word cat is used way more often in daily language than the word magpie. And words that are used more often in daily language are understood to be retrieved more easily from the memory than words that are used less often. This metric is named lexical frequency and is one of the novel psycholinguistic metrics that we investigated in this thesis. And since these novel, so-called item-level metrics are quite new, we do not yet know how they relate to sociodemographic factors. Of note, considering sociodemographic factors is very crucial when interpreting cognitive test performance, as individuals might, for example, perform worse, but it's just due to aging and not due to pathological changes. Therefore, in chapter 5 of this thesis, we looked into 3 sociodemographic factors in their relation to semantic fluency test performance. We looked into age, we looked into sex gender, and we looked into education, and we had the opportunity to do this in 3 geographically, language-wise, and racial, ethnically diverse cohorts. And what we indeed saw is there is an association of both the total number of animals, but also the novel item-level semantic fluency metrics with sociodemographic factors. When taking a deeper look into the Dutch animal fluency data, we actually noticed that participants named disproportionately more birds and fish species during the semantic fluency test, and we were quite curious about that. So we hypothesized that maybe personal background factors, such as hobbies like bird watching, but also prior occupations like a forester, might give individuals an advantage when performing on the semantic fluency test. However, we did not see them having an advantage in the semantic fluency test. In chapter 7 to 10, we moved on to explore biomarkers in relation to MRI-based imaging markers and cognitive test performance. In chapter 6, we looked into multiple measures of microvascular dysfunction, so the state of the small blood vessels, in relation to brain-wide matter connectivity. Brain-wide matter connectivity refers to the efficiency of information transfer in the brain, and thereby we looked at the white matter fiber tracts that connect all the brain regions. In chapter 8, we looked into multiple measures of Alzheimer's disease pathology, but also neurodegeneration and astrocytic activation, and related them to cortical thickness. We looked into both your overall cortical thickness, but also in specific regions that are supposed to be vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease pathology. In both studies, we did not find evidence for an association. In chapter 8, we moved on and looked into plasma biomarkers of microvascular dysfunction and related them to cognitive test performance. For this project, we actually had the opportunity to use 8 cohorts from all over the Netherlands and pool their data. And we indeed saw an association of these plasma biomarkers with cognitive test performance in multiple cognitive domains. In the final chapter of this thesis, we meta-analyzed the literature on one of the 80 plasma biomarkers, namely tau, and related it to test performance on semantic and episodic memory. And again, we did find evidence for an association with both semantic and episodic memory. So in conclusion, we saw that both social and biological factors are related to an increased risk of depression. We saw that sociodemographic factors are associated with semantic fluency test performance. We did not see any evidence for an association of biomarkers of microvascular dysfunction or AD pathology with brain MRI imaging features. But we did see evidence for an association of the blood plasma biomarkers of microvascular dysfunction as well as tau with semantic and episodic memory. Thank you very much for your attention, and with this I would like to give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I want to relieve your paronyms of the heavy burden of this magnificent book. Your position will be opened by Professor De Vught. She is a chair in psychosocial innovations in dementia. Professor De Vught.
Yes, thank you. Dear candidates, congratulations with a very impressive thesis, both in terms of content, but also size, but also the cover. And as I understood correctly, it's a co-production between you and your mother, is it?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, many talents in the family, and also nice to see these drawings come to life in the context of the work that you conducted. So to start off with the discussion, I would like to ask one of your paraninfa to read out statement 7.
A disease diagnosis is not the defining characteristic of a person. We need to refrain from using stigmatizing labels and make use of person-centered language.
Thank you. So, well, this statement, well, I agree with the statement, first to say, but it also made me wonder if you encountered any situations or experiences during your research that make you want to emphasize this point in the statements.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and also for this question. Yes, what we have noticed during the research is especially individuals with depression or dementia may be less likely to participate in a cohort study and get assessed for depression or dementia because of the risk of being stigmatized. So that is one of the reasons why I felt it is important to see that we are individuals with depression, we are individuals with dementia, we are individuals not with diabetes, but not the disease itself.
And did you do anything to overcome this barrier for people to participate?
Yes, so
to lower the stigma that they felt?
Yeah, so personally I wasn't involved with doing the measurements. so I couldn't do something on that behalf. But what was important for me when I was writing my papers is that I always refer to individuals with diabetes, and also teach my students not to call anyone a diabetic or a demented person.
Yeah.
So that's where I felt my contribution.
So something to take into account when also providing information leaflets for research, for example.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, good lesson that you learned. And then I want to ask some questions about chapter 2, because, well, of course, in your thesis you focus on dementia as well as depression, but in chapter 2 you look at the relationship between social factors and depression only, not dementia. Well, of course, you will know that cognition can also play an important role in the interplay between social factors and depression. Can you elaborate on that? Do you have any hypothesis on that? Did you consider to take it into account in this chapter or not? Why?
Yes, so if I understood you correctly, you're interested whether I was considering the interplay between cognition and social factors in relation to depression. So for this chapter, we did not focus on cognition, but I feel like it does play an important role, especially what we see in dementia, for example, that if people have sort of a decrease in their social interactions, we also see that it might increases the risk for dementia. So social isolation is a key risk factor for dementia. And as we know, depression is quite strongly related also to dementia. So what I can imagine is if individuals sort of withdraw and experience social isolation and thereby sort of experience depressive symptoms, maybe it also then sort of again increases the risk for the depression worsening. And
so if you would have taken it into account, how would you do that in your study?
That is a good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is sort of a mediation analysis. So sort of look at the social network characteristic as baseline, then into different cognitive domains as probably a mediating factor, and then see how they relate to the depression incidence. So that's the first thing that I can think of.
Well, interesting, because we actually looked at social network characteristics in relation to dementia and took depression as a mediator into account. And we indeed found that there was an influence of depression on that relationship. So then to your results, strikingly, it's mostly family members that are related to the risk of depression. We also found the same, that it was especially family members, but what we did see was it was mostly the intergenerational contact between family members that influenced, in our case, then the risk of dementia. Would you think that would also be something that would have been important for your study, or do you think that's different for depression? And do you have any indications that there might be an aspect of intergenerational contact that would also be of importance for you?
Yes, so if I understood you correctly, you were interested in whether different intergenerational conflicts could lead to depression, same as to dementia. So by looking at the sort of name generator method, this is the method that we use to assess the social networks with, we couldn't really see by the data that we have what type of family member it is. So what we could see is if someone was living with a partner, if that was related, but we didn't see any evidence there. What we can hypothesize is if that someone, for example, lives with, let's say, 2 family members, it might very well be that is actually children.
And do you have any idea why that could be of relevance in the context of depression?
I can imagine that, and I personally don't have children, so I can only speculate on this. I can imagine that it increases the burden that you have on your depression risk. If you have children, you need to take care of them. What I can also imagine, in the light of our results, where we saw this protective effect, is because you often get probably emotional support. This is our hypothesis. You get this increased emotional support from your family members. But maybe this is irrespective of what type of family members that actually are.
Well, it might be of interest to look
Yeah,
at this. I think there is also a difference maybe because in terms of cognitive functioning, it's also this intergenerational contact that gives other cognitive stimulation aspects, and that might help also in brain health, I guess. In terms of time, I'm not sure if I have...
You can be very short.
Very short, okay. Well, last question is, what about the implications? What do you advise to clinicians or society based on the outcomes of this chapter?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Thank you very much. What I would first like to do, what I think is most important to do, is first do a study into, especially for depression, how people perceive their social support. Because now we actually saw, okay, in terms of maybe quantity, type of social support, but the questionnaire doesn't assess, okay, even if a person has a big or a small social network, maybe they don't perceive the support enough. So I would first like to do research into that, how they sort of rate the level of social support. In terms of sort of therapy options, I think it is crucial that you, also shown by our results, integrate family members in your therapy and also maybe give them sort of tools to show, okay, how can I ask for emotional support from my family members? Maybe also if we do therapy together, how can they provide for emotional support? So to me, those are the two most crucial things in terms of these results.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think there are many barriers still there to overcome, so thank you for your answers. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor De Vught. The opposition will be continued by Professor Cavouzy. She's Chair of Population Cardiovascular Health at the Erasmus University Medical Center. And thank you for having undertaken this quite long journey.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I also, dear Ms. Candidate, I also want to congratulate you with your beautiful piece of work. In terms of quantity, also you have a lot of papers. The majority first author, and a lot of them have already been published. I also want to extend my congratulations, of course, to your supervisory team, your promoters and co-promoters. I also want to start with chapter 2 of your thesis, where you look at the association between social network characteristics and prevalent incident depression. And I have a great interest in looking at sex and gender differences when it comes to cardiovascular disease. So when I was going over this chapter, I was also wondering, did you look at the differences between men and women here? And then I saw that you have somewhere mentioned that you include a sex interaction terminal analysis, and that wasn't significant. But also you are not that concerned, as I see, about, for example, the effect sizes, as I read in your proposition. So I was just wondering, was it completely not significant? Why did you check for it? Did you expect to find differences between men and women in your study? And what was your rationale for that?
Yes. Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your question. So first, we actually expected to see some sex-gender differences, especially because for depression, you see these differences in men and women. Also, 25% of the study population have diabetes. We also see the sex-gender differences in diabetes. So in that sense, we expected these differences, and that's also why we performed this interaction analysis.
And you had expected the stronger associations in women compared to men. What was your...
Yeah, so the hypothesis was actually, or what we've seen in... okay, I need to think back, sorry. Yeah, so my hypothesis, my initial hypothesis was that actually men would be more vulnerable to depression in that sense if they have less emotional support, because I think men are also maybe sort of less likely to open up. So if they have a strong sort of family support, that might be more protective for them, whereas women might be more outgoing. I feel like they also talk a bit more about the depression, so they're also more likely to ask for the social support.
But if you look at the prevalence of the conditions, you would expect to see that more in women, but then, of course, yeah, because of the Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. Also, 50% of your population is almost 50-50. So
Yes.
going back to the discussion about men and women, did you have any information on menopausal status of women in your study?
No, unfortunately not. But it would be really interesting because from what I understood is, especially during menopause, when the estrogen levels drop, that it also has an impact on your brain health. So it would be really interesting to look at in future studies. But unfortunately, Maastricht study, we do not have that
You do not have information. Yeah, because also if you think in terms of if these women are in the early post-menopause or in menopausal transition, maybe there are some mood swings, changes that would also affect both your exposure and the outcomes on their study. So that would have been very interesting to look
Yes.
at, perhaps to gather information in Maastricht study. The first part of your analysis in this chapter is sort of cross-sectional, and of course, it remains a sort of correlation. You really cannot establish any temporality based on that, and then you go to do a sort of follow-up incident analysis. And if I look at that also doesn't deliver much new information. And when I look at the follow-up, it's sort of a short follow-up also. It's about 5 years. I wasn't sure if it's mean, median, but overall remains a short follow-up. So do you think really that you can, with such a short follow-up and with the conditions that you're studying here, do you really think you can establish a sort of temporality, causality here, or what can be the downsides of having a short follow-up here?
I think in terms of depression, I personally wouldn't see it as a problem, because what we see is that depressive episodes are sort of fluctuating, and maybe they last less than a year. So then even with a shorter follow-up, we can actually pick up on that. The other thing is with social network characteristics at that age group that we were looking into, social network characteristics are usually quite stable. It's not an age where they change a lot. I think in later stages, maybe when you're 80, then people sort of fall away. But at this age group, they're quite stable. So I also don't expect a lot of changes there over the years. And that's why I would not expect the follow-up to be a big problem.
So in epidemiology, we talk about something like reverse causality sometimes when we worry about that condition might have been present in subclinical forms at baseline. You don't think that's pertinent to your study because you think that depression episodes are short, and then you don't expect...
Yeah, so why we don't expect the reverse causality in that sense is because we excluded individuals with depression at baseline. However, I do want to acknowledge, of course, it can be also, as it is fluctuating, that people might have a depressive episode in the past and might also sort of, therefore, again, experience the social network characteristics as lower than expected. So in that sense, I want to acknowledge that it might be, but we did our best to overcome it.
Thank you very much. Do I still have time for a question? So may I ask your other partner to read proposition number 6 in your...
A small effect size does not equate to small or little importance.
Thank you. So if we go back again to your chapter 2 with all the associations you had, what should we take on from this? You had a lot of small associations. Also, like in chapter 9, I was looking at the association. So what should I take on? Like, are they all important?
Yeah, so maybe first the reason why I put this statement in there, I feel especially in disease etiology, as opposed to, for example, prognostic research, we usually more often see small effect sizes, also especially because social network characteristics are mostly a continuous variable, and if we look at depressive symptoms also as a continuous variable, again, you'd expect maybe small effect sizes. What I also think is that small effect sizes still might be a sort of necessary cause for something to occur.
So they can still direct us. So that was also exactly what I wanted to arrive at. Like, I think this is context specific. So in etiologic research, you would I mean, small effect sizes, you necessarily don't rule them out because they still can be an indication of, like a pathophysiological background or causality. But in prediction research prognosis, you really mainly want stronger markers, let's say. So there, maybe then the ones with a small effect size don't hold that much. And thank you very much for your answers, and I give back the floor to the director.
Thank you, Professor Cavouzy. The opposition will be continued by Professor de Galan. He is chair of diabetology at this university.
Thank you very much, dear candidate. I first like to congratulate you with your thesis, and with that I'd like to extend my compliments to your supervising team. I really enjoyed reading your comprehensive thesis, and I particularly was impressed by your ability to integrate biological, social, sociodemographic, and even neuroimaging outcomes to study depression and depression and dementia. So that's a compliment. I would like to discuss with you chapter 3, where you focus on depression and diabetes. And in the introduction, you already say there's a clear link between depression and diabetes. You also mentioned in the presentation, and the relation seems to be bidirectional. Now in chapter 3, you perform a systematic review where you focus on HbA1c, and you see that there was a similar bidirectional relationship between the level of A1c and depression. And now in figure 3, you sort of estimate that for every 1% high A1c, the risk of depression increased by 80%, or the odds ratio shows 80%. So I was very happy to read that as a clinician. But then for the reverse, you show me an R of 0.06, and as a clinician, that's rather abstract to me. So my first question is to whether you can make it a little bit more concrete. So how much does depression increase the A1c? By how much?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliments and also for your question. So maybe to first explain, the differences in sort of effect estimates chosen were actually due to the studies that we based them on. So for us, the partial correlation coefficient seemed to be the most suitable, also because a lot of studies adjusted for a different number of confounders, and therefore the partial R sort of takes that into account. And I also do understand that it's a difficult measure to interpret, so there isn't really something you can say, okay, one increase in exposure leads to that number of increase in the outcome. It just gives you an indication of how strong they are correlated, but you cannot really say anything about it.
And do you think this is a strong correlation? So let me rephrase it. So as a clinician, should I be so if there's so a lot of as you know, many people with diabetes have high A1c levels. So should I really factor in that depression could be a major factor in the elevation of A1c?
Yes, so there are maybe two things I would like to say first. Yes, I am very strongly in favor of taking depression into account for HbA1c. What we showed here is that there is a biological link. Again, I think this also plays into the statement that we just read before, effect sizes do not equate to importance.
Right. So you say this is a biological link, and now in your discussion you say you find that this is particularly true for people with type 2 diabetes who are on insulin. You do not find it in people on oral agents, correct?
Sorry, could you repeat?
So you particularly find it in an association between A1c and depression in people with type 2 diabetes who use insulin, and not so much in those with oral agents, if I understood it correctly. I think it's on page 70. So on page 70 you say the results suggest that A1c is only associated with depressive symptoms among insulin users. So it's the final sentence of the first paragraph. And I was wondering what your explanation would be for that. If you can perhaps think about what explains this.
Yeah, so maybe what I would first like to highlight is the majority of studies actually didn't look into type 1 diabetes. So that's why our main sort of focus was on type 2 diabetes, so we cannot really say anything particular about type 1 diabetes and depression. So I would first like to highlight that. What I can imagine is that using insulin is quite invasive and can be quite stressful. So I can also assume that that is actually a big cause of depressive symptomatology.
Right, okay. So what does that tell you about the distinction between psychology and biology as an underlying mechanism?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I do think both still play a role. I can also imagine, but I do not have the background as a clinician, so I can only speculate. I can also imagine that using insulin, because it sort of affects the HbA1c level, it also plays a role, a biological role in depression. So I would still think that both factors are at play when it comes to developing depressive symptoms.
Right. So you mentioned type 1 diabetes has been understudied.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that, I think you suggest that it should be studied in type 1 diabetes as well, and I couldn't agree more. But can you perhaps explain why you think it would be relevant to also to particular investigators in people with type 1 diabetes?
Because from what I understood is, in type 1 diabetes, there might be different disease mechanisms at play that lead to depressive symptoms. Also, type 1 diabetes often occurs way early in life, maybe also at a stage where people are particularly vulnerable to depressive symptomatology, and they might still be children and have to cope with this. So I can imagine that be quite stressful. So that's one of the reasons why I think it also needs to be studied in individuals with type 1 diabetes.
Yes, now you're not a clinician, but maybe I can help you a little bit if I have just one more minute. Yeah. So people with diabetes who use insulin have the ability to check their glucose levels, and nowadays they often use a sensor. Do you think that is a parameter that we should take into account, but that is also a factor in causing depression? You think?
Yeah. So from what I understood is that despite using those sort of glucose monitoring devices, there's still a lot of sort of care that you have to focus on yourself. You're still very much aware, I think, of your blood glucose levels and the indication it has, also with eating and everything. So it might help sort of reduce the stress. I don't think it alleviates it fully.
No, I agree. I think also confounding with the high glucose levels may also be causing sometimes depression. Thank you very much for answering my question. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor de Galan. The opposition will be continued by a neurologist, Professor Julie Staals. She has been a professor from the spring, I imagined, and her chair is called neurovascular disease. Yes, Professor Staals.
Dear candidate, congratulations, of course, with finishing your PhD project and this thesis. Very interesting, and I always learn new things when I read a thesis. Also compliments to the supervisors for nice collaboration between universities. Well, at first sight, you could be surprised to find two different mental diseases in one thesis. Could you comment on that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your questions. Yes, indeed, it might be surprising, but it's also two diseases that are very much linked, especially dementia. A depression has been thought of maybe as a prodromal syndrome of dementia. Can also be that there is a bidirectional association. We don't have enough evidence for this yet, but I think they're very much linked. So I think it's also crucial to assess both of them.
Mm-hmm. Might there be a link in the underlying mechanisms and pathophysiology?
Yes, indeed. So, for example, in chapter 3 and 4, we looked into HbA1c as a mechanism of diabetes, so relation to depression. But we also know, for example, that diabetes is a great risk factor for dementia. So there might be indeed those underlying factors that lead to both depression and dementia.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think, especially vascular, the vascular mechanisms, yes. Yeah, so actually it's a bit of a pity that there is no chapter that integrates both diseases in this thesis. I would like to go to chapter 7 on the association between microvascular dysfunction and brain connectivity in the Maastricht study. I think that's an interesting chapter because it might be relevant for both diseases. First, when I look at figure 1 in the introduction, that's page 11, small letters. It seems to assume that brain connectivity is more relevant in dementia because the blue part is next to dementia.
Yes, so if I may explain, in this thesis, we just didn't look at brain connectivity with depression, but it doesn't mean that it's not important for depression. We just didn't write a paper on it, but a colleague of mine has actually looked into structural connectivity in relation to depression, and she saw some evidence, but I think only in the cross-sectional analysis.
Yeah, and that was I think that was your colleague Gerard.
Ah, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. So you are aware of these results?
Yes, I'm very.
Yeah. Now, going to chapter 7. You found an association between microvascular function and plasma biomarkers, not the renal ones and not the retinal ones, but plasma markers and brain connectivity, but then it did not hold after multiple comparison correction. Do you think it would be interesting to repeat the study, for example, in the smart MR population? That's the other population that you use in this thesis.
That is a good question. Thank you very much. First of all, unfortunately, we do not have the brain connectivity data in the smart MR population. But
if you had,
if I could choose, yes, indeed, because those individuals are all already having vascular damage, as opposed to the sort of Maastricht study population, which is expected to be quite healthy, even though they have diabetes, they're very well regulated, and that was indeed also one of the reasons why we expected, or why we think we didn't see an association, because the study population was healthy. However, I also know that the sort of biomarkers that we used, 80 plasma biomarkers, in the smart MR study were assessed at the first follow-up moment. So again, those individuals with more damage might have already dropped out. So if I could measure them at baseline, then it would be really interesting to see.
Yeah. So maybe the Maastricht study was a bit too young.
Yes, I'm very curious actually now after 10 years of follow-up how the brains of people have changed, and if we could also do longitudinal study.
Yeah. Or maybe there are other markers of microvascular dysfunction. Maybe you took the wrong ones.
Yeah, so why we sort of believe in these ED plasma biomarkers was one of the reasons is their accessibility. So you can just draw blood, then assess the biomarkers. And of course, there might be more precise markers of blood-brain barrier dysfunction. We also suggest dynamic contrast-enhanced imaging. But the problem is, especially in population-based studies, it is quite expensive, it is more invasive. So that's why we thought we would look into the plasma biomarkers. But indeed,
other systemic markers?
Yeah, we also looked into inflammatory markers, for example, but with them we also didn't see an association.
Mm-hmm. And you took the retinal markers and you looked at renal function. Are there any other things you could do? Skin, for example?
The skin measures maybe.
A nail fold.
But so there might be more measures. However, what I think we also need to look at first is to better understand the brain connectivity markers themselves. So one reason might be better markers for microvascular dysfunction that we need, but the other reason is also the brain connectivity markers. We do not fully understand them yet. We, for example, had another colleague of mine that looked into white matter hyperintensities in relation to these brain connectivity markers, and she actually saw quite a surprising result with a higher local efficiency, which we would expect to be good, with higher white matter hyperintensity volume, which was quite surprising. So I think we need a bit more research also to understand the brain connectivity markers and how they relate to general vascular markers, demographic markers.
Brain damage, yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. I have to round up. Thank you for your answers. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Stals. And I forgot to tell you that Professor Stals is also the secretary of this degree committee. And with her, all members of the assessment committee have now asked their questions. So we go over to Utrecht, to an additional opponent, not a member of the assessment committee, Professor van der Schouw. She is working at the UMC Utrecht at the Julius Center, and her chair is chronic disease epidemiology. Professor van der Schouw.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, I always also would like to add my compliments and congratulations to those of my previous opponents. And of course, I want to extend them to your supervisory team. And I'm glad that you stood strong against 4 supervisors. It can be very challenging for a PhD student, but you survived because you're standing here. So well done. You know that every good research raises more questions than it answers, and definitely this was also the case for your studies. And because I'm not an expert on diabetes or depression or cognitive function or dementia, I focused more on the methodology of your studies, and I have some questions about that. And the first one is on chapter 2, on figure 1 on page 36. And it wasn't quite clear to me what you meant with all those numbers in your flow chart. Did you mean to exclude all the persons from your data analysis that are like in the steps more to the right of the lines downward? So in your cross-sectional analysis, did you exclude the persons with missing sociodemographic data, lifestyle data, missing cardiovascular risk factors data?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliments, for your kind words, and for this question. So what we wanted to show by separating it into the cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis is that indeed in the study population with sociodemographic data, for example, there was sort of fewer missings in the longitudinal analysis than in the cross-sectional analysis, because some participants were already removed because they didn't have longitudinal data. So that's why we sort of splitted it up into cross-sectional and longitudinal.
Yeah, I think I did understand that, but if we look at the columns for the cross-sectional analysis, did you indeed exclude the persons with missing sociodemographic data?
Yes, to my knowledge, we did a sort of complete case analysis.
So you did a complete case analysis. Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. I wasn't quite sure about that. But yeah, so that's clear. And I was wondering, why did you decide to do complete case analysis? Did you consider imputation, multiple imputation?
Yes, indeed. I think multiple imputation is a very tricky and widely debated topic. So I know both arguments for and against multiple imputations. One argument against, and that's also why we didn't choose it, is that it still creates artificial data in a sense. So that's why we chose to do the complete case analysis.
And artificial in the sense that you didn't measure it, yeah, like you
Indeed. Yes.
make them up, so to say.
Yes.
And weren't you worried about bias by excluding people with missing data?
Yes, indeed there might be bias because of course there are reasons maybe why those data were not missing, but then also still if you do multiple imputation, you still expect the data to be missing at random. So,
but not completely at
not
random.
completely. Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So, but I do acknowledge that there might be bias because of that.
So I would have been curious to see the findings of a multiple imputed data set and analysis, but I think I won't get the answer today. So let's go to my next question. And I wanted to understand table 1, because as I understood from the text, you excluded the persons with prevalent depressive symptoms from the longitudinal analysis, but there are still 87 people with prevalent major depressive disorders in your study population for the longitudinal analysis. So I was, I'm not an expert on these diseases, so how is that possible? Did these persons not have depressive symptoms?
Yeah, so what I can imagine is that those people are actually maybe also the ones who are treated with antidepressants. So though they might have the diagnosis, maybe due to the treatment for antidepressants, their current depressive symptoms levels are lower than the actual threshold.
Okay, yeah, well, that sounds like a very reasonable explanation to me as well. Thank you. I was very intrigued by your studies on social network characteristics, and I think it's very, very great that the Maastricht study did collect such data and that you were able to analyze them. And for your analysis on the prevalent depressive symptoms at baseline, were those analyses adjusted for confounders?
Yes, all analyses were adjusted for confounders.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and which confounders did you use for the... I wasn't able to find it in the text, but maybe I didn't look very carefully.
Yeah, so the model 1 was adjusted for sociodemographic characteristics. So we always have sex, age, and education, diabetes status in the model 1 usually. Model 2 we adjusted for lifestyle variables. The Maastricht study also had quite a diversity, so smoking, alcohol consumption, moderate to vigorous physical activity. And model 3 we adjusted for cardiovascular risk factors.
Oh, so the same as you used for the Cox regressions?
Yes, indeed.
Because I noticed that you used those for the Cox regression also. And I was wondering how you decided on whether a variable was a confounder and what to include in your model.
So this is the last question.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, okay. So what we usually do is that we look into the literature. Also, there are a lot of studies that have already been done in the Maastricht study, and based on that decide whether they are related to the exposure and the outcome, and then consider them a confounder. So we didn't do techniques like backward selection, forward selection, but it's really more focused on the theory.
Well, I was maybe afraid that some of these might also be intermediate steps in the causal chain, but we have to discuss that over the drinks afterwards, because I give back the word to the prorector.
Yes, the discussion will be continued in the rafter. We go to your last opponent, Dr. Monen. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Alzheimer's Center in Amsterdam. Dr. Monen.
Yeah, Magdalena, congratulations. I think beautifully written thesis, like very clearly written. That was really striking to me. Also, congratulations to your supervisors. My question relates to Chapter 7 and Chapter 9. So how do you feel about these biomarkers of microvascular dysfunction? And zooming in on the plasma endothelial dysfunction markers. Now that you've observed that they were not related to whole brain white matter connectivity, nor with cognitive decline over time. So this may be in contrast to your prior hypothesis, which I can imagine. So what do you think? Should we skip these markers and just go back to small vessel disease features on MRI as a potentially more reliable marker to predict vascular cognitive impairment? Or do you think that lack of associations are due to methodological issues?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and also for your question. Indeed, I still do believe in the field of dysfunction plasma biomarkers, because especially for chapter 9, we do think it's methodological reasons. So most likely those individuals who had cognitive impairment are the ones who maybe dropped out, so attrition bias might be the case. What we also saw in some of the cohorts is that for the selection of whether to measure these plasma biomarkers, they actually required participants to have complete data on cognition at follow-up. Mm-hmm. So then you also exclude those with worse cognition. What we do believe is those individuals who might have worse endothelial dysfunction and also worse cognitions are likely the ones who have dropped out, and therefore it would have led to an underestimation of the association.
Yes, so that's more attrition bias, that's a methodological issue.
And if I may add to that,
sure.
I also think there are sort of different types of biomarkers. So maybe in that sense, so speculating, they're maybe not necessarily prognostic biomarkers, but maybe they can be used as etiological diagnostic biomarkers to sort of see the damage that has happened until then. Mm-hmm. But yeah, future research is needed.
Because that was also one of my considerations, that there may be truly only a cross-sectional association and not over time, which you see more often with certain vascular markers, more at one time point rather than a good predictor. All right, and can you, let's go to chapter 8. I was actually quite surprised again. I mean, in NCDs we've done all these plasma AD biomarkers. And I would have expected that plasma AD biomarkers were related with cortical thickness, and you only find an association between a higher ratio of plasma amyloid beta 42/40 in relation to a lower cortical thickness in the temporal lobe, although you lose that association after multiple correction. But if we still take that association into consideration, which was the only one you found, normally a lower ratio in plasma of amyloid 42/40 is a pathological sign and has been frequently related to clinical progression to MCI and dementia. So I even emailed Inge Verberg, like, hey, this is weird, right? So I said, no, it should be lower. So what do you think about the directionality of that association?
Yeah, I was quite surprised by that as well. Mm-hmm. We actually had that for other biomarkers as well that didn't even reach statistical significance, that they were in a different direction than expected. Still, I do think, also because it didn't survive multiple comparison correction, I would rather see it as a chance finding. Yeah. Especially because we tested so many cortical regions. I wouldn't sort of over-speculate on that one finding in a different direction.
Yeah, I agree with that. Do we have time for one more? Yeah, 2 more minutes. Chapter 2 is very popular, but I want to go to chapter 2 and 3 combined. So really zooming out, and I think we have questions before on the size of the odds ratio that you observed. You found modest odds ratios, both in chapter 2 and in chapter 3. So I want to discuss your view on the role of HbA1c and social network characteristics in the etiology of depression. So do you think that despite these modest odds ratios, these are still important factors? You've said something before, but can you maybe also speculate on other factors than these? Or do you think, no, you should really look at social network characteristics and HbA1c? Or should we look at other factors that you have not addressed in the etiology of depression?
Yes, I think I also want to go back to what I've mentioned in my presentation, actually. Not every depression is the same. Depression is very heterogeneous, also in causes of origin. And I'm also aware that depression might have different causes at different stages in life. So I don't believe that those are the only 2 factors. I think HbA1c maybe helps us explain the link between depression and diabetes. But I still believe there are a lot of other factors that are relevant in the development for depression. So I wouldn't exclude.
Yeah. So you wouldn't consider them to be key players?
No, it's difficult to say because we didn't really compare them to other factors. We didn't do like a whole risk factor analysis and then see, okay, this is the most important factor.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Then I give my word back to the pro-rector. Yeah.
All right. I anticipated this because we have Professor de Cavozy, who has he has perhaps a half a minute question in reserve.
Okay, okay, I'll do that. Dear Mr. Candidate, now I just wanted to look with you at chapter 9 of your thesis, where you looked at some endothelial function biomarkers. And I was just wondering why these specific 3 biomarkers, because it's very difficult to label them only with endothelial dysfunction. To me, they're also involved in a lot of inflammatory pathways, increase in lots of inflammatory, like disorders. Why would these 3? And then you also find very small associations here again. And you mentioned that they're etiologic. They can be, like hint that these are etiologically related in this disease. So can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So especially E-selectin is actually very, it's only expressed on endothelial cells, so it's a very specific marker. And we use these 3 biomarkers because we think they represent a sort of underlying process of endothelial.
So out of respect for Professor de Cavozy, you can add an extra line to your answer.
Yeah. So we expect them to be an underlying process of endothelial dysfunction. We also adjusted for inflammatory markers, and it didn't change the association.
Thank you very much.
Magdalena Beran, the time allotted, reserved, appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I requested you and your company remain in this room, don't go away, and await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Magdalena Beran, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. We took some time for it, so it was a thorough assessment. And in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. So Professor Schramm is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And she will first let you answer to a declaration of integrity. So I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I thereby confer upon you, Magdalena Beran, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights and attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Dr. Beran, dear Magdalena, it's my privilege to be the first to congratulate us with this great achievement. You performed really well in the defense, and I hope you are as proud as I and my fellow supervisors, Miriam, Thomas, and Jet, are of you. Now there are 2 doctors Beran in the room, so also my congratulations to your family here on the first row. I will take this opportunity to give some insights into your journey as a PhD student and highlight some of the finest moments. When we first met in 2019, it was because you wanted to perform an internship for your Master of Epidemiology using data of the Maastricht study. You analyzed the association between social networks and depression with advanced statistics. It has been discussed broadly in this defense. After finishing this, you didn't have enough because you continued with a traineeship on your second master, the Master of International Healthcare Management. And that was the meta-analysis on glycemic control and depression. Both appeared as chapters in your thesis. And next to that, you appeared to be a multi-talent because you've done these completely different projects after each other, but you also assisted one of our PhD students, Jennifer Monerio, on the quality control of MRI scans. That's quite a different sport, I can tell you, more into the technical details of, and specifics of brain scanning. During your traineeship, we came to talk about the vacancy for the PhD project within the NCDC consortium. Your interest was raised and you applied. And look where it brought you. The PhD was part of a national collaboration between dementia cohorts, the NCDC consortium, Netherlands Consortium of Dementia Cohorts. Quite a challenge it was, because you were hired both by UMC Utrecht and Maastricht University, with their different cultures, different approaches of institutions and supervisors. And also your supervisors changed around. So Miriam went from Utrecht to Amsterdam, Jet moved from Utrecht to the US Thomas moved from Maastricht to Utrecht, and I myself partly am now in Rotterdam. So I really admire the way you handled this. It was not always easy to do that. You spent your time as a PhD student very well. And what struck me when preparing this speech is that you collaborated with so many people from so many backgrounds in so many consortia. To name a few, the NCDC consortium, composed of epidemiologists and dementia researchers, but also data scientists with far more technical backgrounds. And also the EDIT consortium, which is mainly composed of psychologists. And of course, the collaborations with the United States, with the YCAP and AAG studies. It took some time to get over the semantics of some of these papers. But importantly, you are still on speaking terms with everyone. So nothing wrong with your collaboration skills or your perseverance. I also take this opportunity to thank all collaboration partners for their participations in your research projects. Some of them are here in the room, and some of them are joining online. Your papers use data from many different cohort studies. I counted 11, which all have their own specific study designs, codebook, language use, and so on. It's an achievement in its own that you have managed to combine and harmonize all this data and write 6 separate papers on them, next to 3 systematic reviews in your thesis. So today, I would like to promote you to cohort data crew. And next to this, you have done many supportive activities in organizing data, constructing a website, verification of data, data harmonization, organization of workshops, of meetings, supervision of many students. You've listed them all in your acknowledgement. I think there were 10, quite a lot. And what is to your credit is that many of those projects were very specific to the student. They were not always in line with your own PhD projects. I think you being a team player and supporting all these activities is a need in future academic research. So I want to congratulate you with that. But it was also sometimes at your own expense. So I've seen that you've recently made some big steps in improving your ability to say no, and you just have to practice it a bit more. We may even forget that at the start of your PhD, there was the COVID pandemic. It was nice to see that because of your internship, you were already connected to the department in Maastricht, and you learned your way around Utrecht rapidly. You coped with the digital working quite well, although you had some difficulties to determine the end of your working day and stop working. Hence your productivity. After the pandemic, you also had a chance to visit some conferences, the INS in Barcelona, where you was robbed. But the content of the program and the people you met there, and actually the people that helped you solve things, was actually making up for it. More close to home, you visited the AAIC in Amsterdam, which is fun also because of many Dutch participants in there. And I personally really enjoyed our PSCD Rapid Conference in Copenhagen, which we visited together with Jennifer. Dear Magdalena, as we said during the Conferral, you are broadly interested and acknowledgeable on all questions that were asked. It has been a pleasure working with you and to see you grow during your PhD. But for various reasons, it's also good that the PhD is now finished. I'm happy that you said yes to a postdoc at the UN and that you will stay for a little longer while we are looking for other opportunities. And what I greatly admire in you is your efforts to learn Dutch, which we greatly appreciate. So how can I finalize this speech other than in my best German? I practiced for it. It has been a while. Jetzt ist die Zeit zum Feiern. Herzliche Glückwunsch. With this, I give the word back to the Prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor Schramm. So, Dr. Beran, I don't know if Beran is Austrian, but pronounced
Czech, actually.
Czech, actually, yeah, and it's Beran also, in Czech.
Oh, no, Beran.
Beran, okay.
It's difficult. I always have to explain.
I was on the Austrian pronunciation. Okay. Also, on behalf of the Maastricht University and its Board of Deans, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. And as a general practitioner, I was struck by your last statement, and it was a very philosophical and sophisticated statement by Julia Engelman. But the first part of it, as a GP, having a lot of people in my waiting room, I would say the first part would be something I could pinpoint in my waiting room. So, unser Leben ist ein Wartezimmer, niemand ruft uns auf. That would really help me in my daily work. So I have the last logistic announcements. So we have a nice reception offered by you. It's outside in the sun, so that's a great thing. And in Dutch we say it, we go outside, we gaan naar buiten, naar de binnenplaats. So in this formerly monastery, we have a place where the monks pray to their books full of prayers, and so you will see about this. And I think, Mrs. Pedal, we have first a photograph here. So I would ask the non-family members of this audience to already go outside and just have the first drink already without the candidate. Thank you very much, and with these words, I will close this academic session. So it's possible